Hello, and welcome to Southern Tier Gardening. My name's Eric, and in tonight's video, I wanted to continue the discussion I started kind of in my last video about answering the question as far as how I decide what I plant. As far as, there's a lot of choices out there. There's a lot of options. If you look in seed catalogs, or if you're buying transplants at a nursery or a big box store, you're going to be confronted with a lot of choices. So I started to talk to you guys in my last video about how I decide what I plant. You've only got so much room in your garden. So I started with the most basic thing to think about is obviously when you're deciding what plants to grow in your garden, you want to obviously grow stuff that you or your family is going to eat. You want to grow things that you obviously enjoy eating. So that's why I grow lots of tomatoes. I grow lots of peppers. That's pretty obvious. Now, that being said, when you start growing your own vegetables, you will start to actually appreciate some things that you didn't think you liked. A great example for me is turnips. I never liked turnips. I don't even know if I ate them as a kid. But a lot of people around me, a lot of gardeners that I know, grow turnips, and they're really easy to grow in my area in the wintertime. So a couple years ago I threw some seeds in the ground and I grew some turnips. Well, wouldn't you know, they grew real well, and what I did with them is I cut them into quarters and drizzled the turnips with some olive oil, and I put a little salt and pepper and some rosemary on them, and I roasted them in the oven. They were delicious, absolutely amazing. So you can actually discover some things that you didn't think you liked by growing your own food. But in general, if you're limited on space and you're trying to decide what to grow, you want to grow things that you enjoy eating. After that, I talked briefly about, in my opinion, sometimes things that are, when they're mature, as far as the fruits, things that are a little bit smaller tend to be easier to grow. So I always like to have some of those crops and varieties in my garden. A good example are tomatoes. Cherry tomatoes, a smaller fruit. Pickling cucumbers, a smaller fruit. They tend to be easier to grow, especially for beginners. So I always like to have some of those crops in my garden. And then, you'll always want to challenge yourself and grow some larger tomatoes, but that also comes into play when I'm deciding what I want to grow. So in tonight's video, I wanted to continue that discussion with the other huge factor for me when I decide both crops and what varieties I'm going to grow. And that is disease resistance. As we're looking at my spring garden here, every year I sort of have a different sort of theme or plan for my garden. Last year I grew lots of peppers. Last year I went all in on peppers. I forget, but it had to have been at least 10 different varieties of both sweet peppers, hot peppers, you name it. I grew habaneros, I grew serranos. I did that mainly to learn what varieties of peppers do well in my area. And as I harvested them, I learned what kind of peppers that I actually like to eat. So last year I was all in on peppers. So this year, and this is what goes back to what I was talking about as far as choosing varieties of plants that have built-in disease resistance. This year, I'm all in on tomatoes. You guys who've been watching my channel, you know I'm growing a ton of tomatoes this year. I'm all in. But more specifically, this year, everything that you see in this garden are varieties that have built-in disease resistance. And what I mean by that is whether you're shopping a seed catalog, or buying transplants, you're often going to see that they in the descriptions of the variety whether or not they have disease resistance. And big picture, if the variety that you're choosing is an heirloom, it tends not to have as much disease resistance. The opposite end of the spectrum is a hybrid. So when you're choosing your seeds or your transplants, if you see that they're described as a hybrid, that means that those plants have been developed to have some built-in disease resistance. And why that is so important for me is because of where I grow. I deal with a lot of heat and humidity. And these plants, they don't necessarily mind the high temperatures. What becomes problematic is the humidity. When these plants, when the moisture stays on these leaves for long periods of time, it just becomes a breeding ground for these plant diseases that can literally destroy your entire crop in, just a few days. And that's what's happened to me in the past. I've lost entire crops to different types of blights, powdery mildew, these diseases that affect your plants. And unfortunately, a lot of the heirloom varieties are more, in my experience, more susceptible to these diseases. So this year, I decided to devote this entire garden, mainly I'm growing tomatoes, but everything that I'm growing this year is a hybrid variety, or they have, like I say, built-in disease resistance. Now, I'm going to take a lot of notes. I hope to learn a lot of things with this year's garden. Now, next year, I definitely will go back to growing some heirloom varieties. I love some examples of heirloom variety tomatoes are like your Cherokee Purple, your German Johnson. They're delicious tomatoes. Your heirlooms often have different color to them. They're more unique. They're more rare. You don't see heirloom varieties often in your grocery store. But unfortunately, for me, the heirloom varieties just aren't as productive, and they're more susceptible to disease. So this year, the third main factor that went into what I chose to grow this season was disease resistance. And some examples of this are my determinate tomatoes. These are these 3 rows right here that I have on the Florida Weave trellis. This variety is called Amelia, and they're known for having great disease resistance. For my indeterminates, now my cherry tomatoes, I've never had any issues with cherry tomatoes, but for my big beefsteak style tomatoes, these are the tomatoes that you're going to slice and make a tomato sandwich with. These are the what you're really looking forward to in the garden. This particular year, these indeterminate varieties that I'm growing are two. I've scaled back on the number of different varieties. This year I'm only growing two varieties. One is called Parks Whopper Improved, and the other one is called Beefmaster. And I chose these two varieties once again because they have built-in disease resistance. So I'm hoping that these plants live longer, that they don't die as soon to disease, because my first frost isn't until Thanksgiving time. So it's not frost that kills these plants. For me, growing in zone 8B, I'm not far from Savannah, Georgia. The humidity down here, just the disease is what kills my plants. So I just wanted to kind of follow up on the last video as far as that being a huge factor in what varieties I choose to grow. So next we can take a look. This is what I've been harvesting this week. I'm harvesting lots of cucumbers. You can see, and this is what I talked about. I only grow these smaller pickling cucumbers, and you can see some of these, get pretty good size. Most of them are smaller picklers, but the reason I grow these is because the length of time to get them to maturity is so much shorter, and you can still, I can pickle these cucumbers, or they're still delicious cut up fresh in salads. I harvested my first peppers this week. You can see I harvested some sweet banana peppers, and I'm also continuing to harvest yellow squash. So this is the time of year when things are really starting to happen in the garden. So next, I wanted to come over and show you guys this garden. The big news this week is I planted all of my sweet potatoes. I'm going to try to get over here where you guys can see this. I have 3 rows of sweet potatoes planted. And in the past, when you grow sweet potatoes, I've talked about this, you don't actually put the potato in the ground. What you actually plant is called a slip. And that's what these are. I'm going to get down here close to one so you guys can see. But this little transplant here, you can see, it's almost like you're putting a transplant in the ground. Below the soil here is just roots. So these are called slips. And in the past, I've bought these slips from my local feed and seed store. Well, this year, when I went to buy my sweet potato slips a couple weeks ago, they told me that with the current supply chain issues and the things that we're dealing with, they didn't have any. They couldn't get slips this year. So for the first time this year, I had to buy these slips online. I've never really bought plants online, but I bought 3 different varieties, and I purchased 12 plants of each variety. So I bought 36 slips, and they came in this kind of cool little box right here. The company is called Steel Sweet Potatoes. They're up in Tennessee. This little box had holes in it, and the slips came in here. It was overnight delivery, and it also came with a full recipe guide and a growing guide. So it comes with a full growing guide as far as planting, how to deal with these slips once you get them in the mail, how to handle them, and it came with a little recipe guide. So that was pretty cool. So when I used to buy these potato slips from the feed and seed store, I was limited to one variety. Last year it happened to be Bayou Belle. You had to buy what they had. But ordering from Steel sweet potatoes up in Tennessee, this company had probably, I don't know, 12 different varieties of sweet potatoes that you could choose from. So I took advantage of that, and this year I'm growing 3 different varieties of sweet potatoes. This first variety is called Beauregard. This middle row here is called Georgia Jet. And then this last row, which I'm kind of excited about, they're called O. Henry. And they are a white sweet potato. So at first I was disappointed that I couldn't buy my slips at my local store, but it ended up actually working out pretty cool because I'm able to compare these 3 different varieties. This Beauregard was developed down in Louisiana. So this variety has been developed to grow in very hot, humid conditions. The Georgia Jet, obviously I live in the state of Georgia, so that's a variety that I think will do real well for me. And then this O. Henry is actually a white sweet potato. The flesh is white. So I'm really excited to be able to compare these 3 different varieties. If you remember, this is the garden where I've got my Cherokee tan pumpkins going here on the end. These are coming along great. You can see the variegation on these leaves. They sort of have, that's not powdery mildew on there, that's actually the variegation of the leaf. I'm starting to get some true leaves forming on these sweet potatoes, or I'm sorry, not sweet potatoes, these Cherokee tan pumpkins. So I'm pretty excited about that. Speaking of that, I wanted to make a correction. In one of my previous videos, I said that I was talking about the importance of crop rotation, and I misspoke. I said that sweet potatoes are in the mallow family, and that was incorrect. Sweet potatoes are actually in the morning glory family. So that's why it works out perfect for me to, in the springtime in this garden plot, I had regular potatoes planted, and they are in the nightshade family. So that's why it works out great for me to be able to come in after that and plant these sweet potatoes, because they're in the, like I say, the morning glory family. Now the reason I misspoke, if you look at this row of plants right here, these are my okra plants, and these are coming along real nice. They're starting to get some, real true leaves on them. And okra is the plant that is actually in the mallow family. They're related to cotton. So anyway, I got my sweet potatoes planted yesterday. These slips, they don't look real good right now. I keep them heavily watered, and it's going to take them a couple weeks to really get established. But once they start growing strong roots, this entire area where the sweet potatoes are planted will just be covered with sweet potato vines. And another cool thing about growing your own sweet potatoes are the vines of sweet potatoes are completely edible. You can harvest throughout the season while you're waiting for your sweet potatoes to mature. You can cut off some of the vines, and you would cook the leaves just like you would spinach or collard greens or kale, and the leaves are fully edible. And talk about nutritious. I mean, everyone knows how good sweet potatoes are for you. Well, the leaves are the same way. So that's another cool thing about being able to grow sweet potatoes in your backyard, is you can take advantage of actually eating some of the leaves. And the plants themselves actually benefit from a little bit of pruning. So you come in and you take some vines out, and you have a nice little side dish of some cooked down sweet potato leaves. But you can see here, like I say, these slips don't look like much now, but they're once they get rooted, You want to, right when you plant your sweet potato slips, you want to keep them really heavily watered. But once they're established, sweet potatoes are very drought tolerant. They don't need much water once they're established. So that's what's happening in the garden right now. I apologize here for my neighbor's dog. He's wanting to contribute to the video. But anyway, I'm really glad you guys have joined me here. I'm glad I was able to kind of finish up my discussion as far as the importance of choosing disease-resistant varieties in your garden. I hope that you kind of think about that. But the flip side is, give everything a try. I don't want to discourage you from growing heirlooms. Like I say, next year, I'll probably do a combination of hybrid varieties and heirloom varieties. But this year, I'm all about production. I want to be able to grow enough tomatoes to can them, and I make stewed tomatoes, I make tomato sauce, and I make salsa. I want to be able to grow enough tomatoes to make enough jars of product to last me right through the winter. So to do that, I'm like I say, I'm all in on these hybrids. I mean, just to give you a quick example, the variety of these determinate tomatoes is Amelia. And I'm starting to get a lot of tomatoes forming on these plants. They're really productive. You can kind of see down here, there's just lots of tomatoes forming on these. So I have 16 of these determinate tomatoes planted, these Amelias. And a conservative estimate would be 10 tomatoes per plant. So right there, conservative estimate, I'm talking about 160 tomatoes. Now, if I continue to keep these plants healthy and things go to plan, I could easily get closer to 20 tomatoes off of each of these plants. So now we're talking about 320 tomatoes. So that's what I'm doing this year. I'm all about production. I want to grow as much food as I can in this 15 by 25 foot space as I can. So that's why I'm all in on tomatoes. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm still growing eggplant. I'm still growing yellow squash. I'm still growing 4 different varieties of peppers. But my main goal this year is, like I say, I'm all in on hybrid tomato varieties. So yeah, that's about it for today's video. As always, I can't thank you guys enough for joining me, and I hope you guys get something out of this. So hopefully can't wait to see you next time. And as always, grateful gardening.